Today's top story from the perspective of someone who's there.
You are looking live.
This just in.
Not my beat.
If there's a trade, we have to talk to Kevin Pelton. Those are the rules. ESPN.com, NBA writer who's been doing trade grades and so much more great analysis for ESPN for years. And it's our pleasure to have him back on the show. KP, what's up, my guy?
Nothing much. Yeah. Happy to be on call for you.
Yeah, well, I mean, look, you're on call for people way more important than me, like the people that pay your paycheck. So I appreciate a little bit of time during a very, very busy time. Let's dive right in. Like, what do you give the Wizards for the Jordan Poole trade yesterday, and why?
Yeah, I gave them a B+ on this one. I mean, fundamentally, this is a trade that boils down to, would you rather have the 1 year left on CJ McCollum's contract or the 2 years left on Jordan Poole's contract? And I'd rather have the 1 year. I think if Jordan Poole didn't have substantial trade value after the season that he had last year, where he actually kind of did all the things I think that the Wizards were hoping that he would do when he got to Washington, when they included him in the Chris Paul trade, I don't think it was going to happen after next year either. I think to rebuild his trade value, he's going to have to show what he can do in New Orleans, that he can be a part of a winning team and, contribute in that way. And that, the offensive stats that he puts up are not kind of just empty parts of a team that isn't really particularly going anywhere. And, maybe he could have done that, particularly with more veterans. We did see the Wizards being more competitive once they got Chris Middleton and Marcus Smart in there. But I don't know that the fact that those guys, were able to make them successful and Poole alone necessarily reflects that well in his value either. So this way you get CJ McCollum, who's, someone who is going to sort of be complementary to the Wizards' young talent for whatever period of time he is on the roster. And then, either he's traded at the deadline or he's an expiring contract, and then the Wizards grab all this additional cap space for the summer of 2026, where, there's going to be a lot more teams with cap space. It's not going to be a situation like this year where Brooklyn was able to extract a first-round pick for taking on, a not unreasonable Terrence Mann contract in another deal that happened yesterday, but still going to be in a position where they probably will have the most money on the board and be the team that other teams are calling when they need to dump contracts.
So B+ is good, depending on who or how you feel about your academics, but it's certainly a good trade grade. What would they have needed to do to get an A for you, if that's a fair question I can ask?
Get some positive draft return. I mean, they are giving up the number 40 pick in this year's draft. I don't think that's going to be, a huge difference maker for the Wizards, given the first round picks that they have and the youth that they already have on their roster. But, giving up number 40 for a future second rounder, the odds are, not good necessarily that you're going to get a pick higher than that in the future. And I think the Wizards are okay with that. But, if they had pulled this off without including that, then we're getting into the A range.
Got it. So when you look at this draft now, is there anybody in particular that, like I think of like a Jeremiah Fears, obviously at the point guard position directly, but even a guy like Ace Bailey, who's been mocked to the Wizards a lot, including by your ESPN colleagues, Jonathan Givony and Jeremy Woo, like there's just more shots available? Like, is there someone that you think fits the Wizards now, and especially even better without Poole? Like what direction if you're the Wizards, are you hoping the board goes tonight? To have someone available.
Yeah, I mean, I do think this potentially signals, more likelihood that they go guard because, CJ McCollum is someone who is still capable of starting and, probably will expect that is his role for whatever period of time he's on the roster. He's clearly not part of your future in the way that Jordan Poole potentially was, given his age. So, if it is Jeremiah Fears, I think that does make a lot of sense. Ace Bailey, it's a tough one for me to wrap my head around. He was so inefficient as a scorer at Rutgers. And one of the earliest draft truths I feel like I learned, was with Adam Morrison in particular. And there's been a number of guys that I can think of since then. But Johnny Davis would frankly be an example of this to scare off Wizards fans. If you're making difficult shots in college, while that shot making is impressive, the fact that you aren't able to get easy shots against college opposition is a huge red flag for your ability to do so at the NBA level, where you're going to need to, unless you're Kevin Durant. And I think we have established, based on the combination of Ace Bailey's freshman season and the measurements that we saw at the combine, that he is not Kevin Durant, who was rightfully considered a unicorn when he came out of college. Like, it's going to be very difficult for you to score efficiently, subsisting primarily on mid-range jumpers off the dribble. So I do think, there are situations where if Ace Bailey goes to the right team, that he can improve his shot selection, make good on the defensive potential that we did see last year at Rutgers, that I think was very exciting, and the obvious shot making skill, and become a good player. I think there's some comparisons to maybe Boston's two star players, Jaylen Brown and Jason Tatum. Jaylen Brown, in my projections, had basically the worst projection of any player who has been successful of all time. I think he was like 103 in the stats only rankings, and a little higher in the consensus version that also factors in where they are in that big board from not necessarily the mock draft, but the top 100 that Wu and Gavoni do, that sort of is more a clearer distillation of where they think on pure talent. But he dramatically outperformed that. Jason Tatum, like, I think people forget that at Duke, there was a lot of concern that he was going to be this, low volume scorer, low percentage shooter based on what we saw from him. And both those guys went to a team in Boston that was veteran laden, where to play, they had to learn good habits and be role players for a period of time. So the thing that concerns me is when I hear reported, forget about the workouts, I don't care about that, but hear reported that Ace Bailey wants to go to a situation where he can shoot as much as possible to develop as a star. That's not how you develop as a star. How you develop as a star is by developing good habits. So that's what would concern me with the Wizards specifically, although at some point there is a spot where Ace Bailey, the potential outweighs the risk.
Yeah, for sure. And they have good vets here, but if he is thinking he's going to come in and not learn from, like, hey, no, CJ, I got it. I just give me the ball and I'll shoot. CJ McCollum and Marcus Smart and Chris Middleton, then that's obviously less than ideal and is not going to work out. Kevin Pelton, ESPN, with us here on the Hoffman Show. So getting back to the trade market and kind of some wider thoughts, although I guess this one folds into why the Wizards do this, right? You talked about the 2 year versus 1 year. They're going to have boatloads of cap space next year, which will allow them to absorb contracts and hopefully draft capital with them. That's the whole reason they would be absorbing them. Or they can trade for an expensive but good player if they, win the draft lottery next year and want to kickstart things into a higher gear. But the main thing is, like, they're going to make themselves available as a trade landing spot for someone expensive. In the modern league, Kevin, with the second apron, which is basically acting as a hard cap, teams looking to shed salary more often, like, how do you change how you value what the Wizards have done here conceptually? Like, it's obviously specific to the Wizards, but like the concept of what they're pushing for here.
Yeah, I think one of the things we're still wrapping our mind around is, like, what's the cost of dumping salary at this point? And that's a tough equation because you just sort of don't know, how much in the league do teams consider a player overpaid? I mentioned that Terrence Mann deal that the Nets made yesterday, where they got the number 22 pick in this year's draft for taking Terrence Mann 3 years left at $15.5 million. Like, that's an overpay for Terrence Mann. I didn't like it when the Hawks gave up second round picks to get him for Bogdan Bogdanovic at the deadline from the Clippers. But, like, Terrence Mann is clearly a useful player. If he was in free agency, would it be $10 million a year that he would get on a similar deal? $8 million, somewhere in that range. So we're talking like 15 to 21 million. They got a first round pick to get off of. And, I don't think the value is going to be that great for Washington or anyone else, looking forward, because Brooklyn was so uniquely positioned in terms of having cap space this summer. And, there weren't a lot of teams that can make a deal like that. But if that's the value and you're the Wizards and you're sitting there looking at, 80 million or whatever the number is, I haven't even really looked closely at what the number might be for cap space next summer, and the equivalent in terms of taking on long-term contracts using these expiring deals at the deadline, like that's a lot of picks you can accumulate. And that's the one thing is, so far I think it's more been about kind of cleaning things up for Washington than necessarily accumulating these big time assets. Although obviously they did get, several first round picks last year and then ended up with AJ Johnson to give them another 2024 first round pick.
Is there anybody, I don't know if you've gotten ahead on this work yet, and if so, we can just keep it moving. I'll ask you my last question. But is there someone or some ones that you kind of see as a target of, like, ooh, that's a hot spot that teams are looking at around the league, where a player, they're probably going to want to get off that player a year from now? Or is it just, is the lesson of the NBA Finals and these NBA playoffs that who the hell knows, because we don't know who might get hurt or what, team might surprise us, or in the Pacers case, both.
Yes, exactly. Indiana is, I think, a team that you'll look at because if they re-sign Miles Turner, they'll push into the luxury tax. And it was one thing for them to start the season in the tax with Tyrese Halliburton healthy and knowing that you've got a chance to go to the finals again. I think it's going to be much tougher for them to justify now. I still think, you need Miles Turner as part of this group long term, so is that Obi Toppin? Is that Benedict Mathurin that they end up having to shed? Kind of depends where the Turner contract comes in, but that's a team, I'm definitely keeping my eye on between now and the 2026 trade deadline. As you said, yeah, I mean, we knew Boston, something was likely to happen with Drew Holiday, given the size of his contract and the size of the luxury tax bill that they were staring at. But we didn't know that it was going to be as extreme as what we've already seen from Boston. And, based on what my colleague Shams Charania reported last night, it sounds like they're still taking calls on Jaylen Brown and Derek White. So there's still maybe more to come. Phoenix is then the obvious other team that everyone's going to look at. They want to do it right now, I think. So, the expiring contracts from Washington may not be as valuable, but, they're still a team that at this point is over the second apron, and it doesn't really make much sense and they've got a mismatched roster now where they've got these multiple shooting guards. So plenty more to come, but yeah, there's going to be teams we just don't necessarily know exactly which ones in a year.
So ending on Phoenix leads to the last question, because the trade that happened, the Poole trade, is a direct descendant, if you will, of the Beal contract and the Beal trade. So if we put the starting point at when the current regime, Winger, Dawkins, get here to DC, what have you made of the project and how Washington has dug themselves out of that hole and how they've set themselves up while acknowledging that they have done next to no winning on the court so far?
I mean, I wrote the other day that I think patience is the most valuable commodity in the modern NBA. And, the Wizards for a long period of time were among the franchises that exhibited no patience, and it's the reason they got in this hole in the first place. And they have been very patient for the last few years, and I think done well. And, I think the one thing I would say about this group is they have not yet been able to hit a home run. If you look at, the way that Oklahoma City got set up, the way that Houston got set up, they hit home runs via trade that were able to facilitate the young rosters that they've built. And Washington hasn't done that yet. There hasn't been we're getting 3 first-round picks for this guy. The only guy they got multiple first-round picks for, if I'm remembering correctly, is Denny Avdia. And frankly, if you look at that a year later, as that happened on the night of the draft, they didn't get enough for Denny Avdia. I think it would take many more first-round picks to acquire Avdia a year later, as well as he played in Portland. But they have hit a lot of singles, maybe some doubles. They're continuing to stack together base runners. I think eventually that's going to pay off, especially if they are able to hit that home run at some point through the draft, which would either require this year's number 6 pick being much better than we expected, or some lottery luck next year, given that it didn't work out for them this year. But they have undone the damage now. They're they basically have the cleanest cap sheet in the league, because even Brooklyn has some long-term contracts on their books to go along with all the cap space this summer. And, now they're in the position, I think, to really start making some more favorable trades, as opposed to being forced to trade from more of a position of weakness.
Right, and that's the thing about that Oklahoma City rebuild. It doesn't happen without Paul George and the leverage they had over the Clippers because of the Kawhi Leonard factor, and that gets them Shea, and you hit the ground running. The Wizards, they didn't have any assets really to trade. They had an expiring Kristaps Porzingis, who they didn't have. It was like, we do the deal or we lose him for nothing. It was Beal who had the no trade clause, so they were really backed into a corner there. And obviously they did their best with Kyle Kuzma, and obviously, I think they probably, in hindsight, would have rather traded him last summer than they did at the deadline. But you didn't know that was going to happen. So it's a tough league, Kevin Pelton. So that's what I've heard. It's tough to win. Kevin Pelton writing about it all, ESPN.com. He'll have trade grades for any other deals that go down, as well as draft grades as well after tonight and tomorrow. Kevin, always appreciate you, sir. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Hey, this is DA, and you're listening to The Hoffman Show on the Team 980 and the Odyssey app.